السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، حبيبنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. أما بعد. Today we speak about the first so far we've been sort of building up a foundation for understanding the desires. So the very first desire that Imam Ghazālī hits upon are two of them, and they are among perhaps the most destructive of the two desires. The first desire is the desire for food, hunger, eating, gluttony, and the second is the desire for the opposite gender. And both of these are extraordinarily destructive. Imam Ghazālī explains that when a person's stomach becomes full, then once that desire is satiated, the nafs moves on to the next desire, which is the desire for the opposite gender or for fulfilling the needs of the private parts. And then once that's fulfilled or unrestricted, then the next desire that it moves on to is one of wealth. And then when that is fulfilled, then the next is for love of oneself or fame. And so all of these he describes are linked. So for example, if a person is hungry all the time and he's just worried about his next meal, he tends not to move on to the next desire of his private parts. And if that is left, then a person tends not to move on to the next, which is the love of dunya, of the wealth and of fame. And then when a person's love of wealth and fame becomes fed, then from there arise the other diseases of the heart, like arrogance, ostentation, kibr and riyā, hasad, jealousy, animosity and enmity, because all of these really at the end of the day are sort of a person trying to fulfill their desire for wealth or for fame or that which has to do with the dunya. So all of these things are linked, but the very first thing that we start off with is the stomach. Ibn Aṭā'illah rahimahullah, he says, حَرَامٌ عَلَى مَنِ اسْتَكْثَرَ مِنَ الشَّهْوَاتِ أَن تُفْتَحَ لَهُ أَبْوَابُ الْغُيُوبِ. That the one who frequently fulfills his desires, it is not permitted for him for the doors of the ghaib to be open, for the doors of the unseen to be open. Meaning this person who is constantly fulfilling his desires, he remains limited to the dunya and what he can feel and see. From there, Allah closes the doors for him of the unseen, and he becomes trapped in this dunya. So today, we'll start off by speaking about hunger, and then we'll move on to the private parts. It really won't take too long. There's not much to say. But I will start off by saying that both of these desires are often mentioned, often used to be emphasized a lot by ulama, because they saw the destructive nature of both of these. Today, we tend not to talk about the destructive nature of food, and traditional ulama still tend to talk about the destructive nature of the opposite gender, intermingling, which is impermissible, dealing with the non-maharim, and so on. So especially at the age which most of you are at, both of these become very important, because you are at the age where the desires are perhaps the strongest, and the ability to fulfill those desires are perhaps the strongest as well. And so that means that you have to, and the opportunity as well is pretty strong. And so then it becomes necessary for a person to recognize them and then take steps to counter them, especially when today these things are basically brought to your feet all of the time. Right? You can't walk 2 feet without having a vending machine around you. You can't go anywhere without advertisements for food constantly in your face. And then the same thing for those things which are haram to look at, to listen to engage in when it comes to the opposite gender and interaction with them. These things are essentially brought into our pockets at this point, and they're constantly in front of us. So recognition is important, and then acting up against it is the next step. So Imam Ghazālī rahimahullah, he explains that when it comes to hunger, there are a lot of benefits. Before we get into this, let me explain what we mean by hunger. Often if you read the works and the books of the ulama of old, they will speak about fasting for days And I don't necessarily mean fasting in the sense of that we normally do from sunrise to sunset, which is the shara'i fasting, but fasting as a means of weakening the nafs, and they would just do it for days on end, meaning they will live or suffice just with water in order to weaken the nafs. Or they would restrict themselves from food that has a lot of energy and nutrients, so for example like meat, as a means of weakening themselves. But this is no longer recommended. That was for that time. Today, if a person engages in these things, he tends to not just destroy his own body, but he tends to cause the opposite reaction. So instead of his nafs becoming weakened, it actually becomes stronger instead. So he may weaken his body and certain desires may become less, but he instead strengthens his arrogance, his ostentation. He starts thinking of himself as being better because look at me, I'm fasting every single day. Or look at me, I'm able to do such and such by not eating. So what the ulama today recommend for the likes of us is much, much less. So what's most beneficial when it comes to fasting is to fast in the month of Ramadan. Well, that you have to, it's fard. But then to pick up the nawafil fast as a means of causing hunger to oneself. So that will be like the sunnah fast of Ayyam al-Bīḍ, the 3 days in the middle of the month, Mondays and Tuesdays, and then the other days throughout the year that arise in which there is a benefit in the nafil fast. Now, in this type of fasting, we'll get to it. So here, causing hunger is one, the fasting, the nawafil fast, as I mentioned. The other is to restrict yourself from overeating. So as we know that the Prophet ﷺ recommended that a third of the stomach be kept for food, a third of the stomach be kept for drink, and a third of the stomach be kept empty or for air. Now, for most people, this will be difficult, right? The stomach is not that large of an organ, and if you just fill 1/3 of it, then you still feel like you're hungry. So that usually is sufficient for a person to keep themselves hungry. Now, what are the benefits of hunger? The first that Imam Ghazālī mentions is that it helps to purify the heart, and it helps to give clarity to basira. Basira is insight. As there is basar, which is eyesight, which is the sense of vision. Basira is insight, which is the clarity that comes to the heart, the ability to recognize things as they are, the ability to see where things will go. So it's tied in with wisdom, but it's also tied in with foresight. A person who sticks to hunger, and so perhaps for our purposes for this day and age, we will step away a little bit from what Imam Ghazālī is saying because his was for a different time, and for us we'll define hunger as not becoming full. So hunger for us will be not becoming full. So eating not to the point of fullness, but stopping before that, such that you do still feel like you could eat more, although you've eaten enough. Enough to be satiated, meaning your hunger is more or less knocked down, but not so much to the point that you feel full. So a person who does that now, he purifies his heart. He clarifies or gives himself insight. Because a person who fills himself to the full, that person, that fullness, it leads to foolishness. As we had mentioned before, that when the stomach is full, the nafs starts to look at other desires. And so it leads a person to foolishness, to saying stupid things, to wasting time doing nonsensical things or useless things, to then move on to fulfilling other desires and so on. It blinds the heart, Imam Ghazālī says. And that makes sense. When the heart is no longer one of basira, then it becomes one of blindness. It's not able to have foresight. It's not able to have perception anymore. And what is the purpose of the heart? Imam Ghazālī has mentioned before that one of the prime reasons, if not the prime reason for a person's existence, is ma'rifah. Is to come to the recognition of Allah and connect with Him. So if a person's heart is full, he lacks basira. He can't have ma'rifah either. And so he mentions this line that hunger is a means of knocking on the doors of Jannah. So when a person remains hungry, that hunger leads to things. It's as if it's knocking on the door of Jannah. The insight that he gets, the ma'rifah that he gets, that this is a means to his Jannah. So the first thing is that. The second benefit that he mentions is that it softens the heart. So much so that a person has now, he feels pleasure in his ibadah. He feels pleasure in recitation of the Quran. When he remembers Allah in dhikr and ibadah, it has an effect on him that it normally would not have. So the heart goes through states as well. Sometimes it's hard, sometimes it's soft, sometimes it cries, sometimes it becomes angry. And so hunger causes fear of the heart. It causes softness. It allows it to connect with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so it leads it to these states that allow it to become closer to Allah and allow it to get closer to Jannah. Number 3, it humbles the nafs. It breaks it, in a sense. Its arrogance is broken. It becomes easier for it to feel for other people. Number 4, that hunger is a type of difficulty, and difficulties are the path to Jannah. Sometimes those difficulties are placed upon us by Allah, and other times we can put them upon ourselves with a particular purpose in mind, which is islah, which is what we're speaking about. So a person who takes himself to hunger, there's a certain type of adhab in that. And it reminds him of the adhab of the akhirah. Anytime we have difficulties, we are reminded of the adhab of the akhirah as well. So normally we're not permitted to harm ourselves. We aren't permitted to harm ourselves. But hunger is a sort of an adhab without actual physical harm. Right? So then we're not talking about starvation here. We're talking about just not becoming completely full. Not becoming full. So in that is a punishment without a harm to oneself. And that allows a person to become one of the people of Jannah by feeling some of the adhab of this dunya and then being reminded of the adhab of the akhirah. Number 5, he mentions, and he says this is from one of the greatest of benefits, is that it breaks the desire to sin. Hunger breaks the desire to sin. It allows a person to gain dominance over his nafs, especially the nafs, which is ammara bisu, the one that commands towards evil. It allows it to gain dominance over it, to break the desires that normally lead us to sinning. Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anh, he said, I have never filled myself, meaning my stomach, except that I started to consider a sin. Now, of course, when it comes to Sayyidina Ali or any of the companions for that matter, we don't really imagine them sinning because they are someone that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already forgiven, and Allah is pleased with them and they are pleased with him. But here Sayyidina Ali is mentioning the state of the nafs, and as a human being he has a nafs as well. And so he mentions that whenever he came to fullness, he had this insight over his nafs, as we all should, and he realized that the fullness led to this consideration of sinning. Number 6 is that it lightens the body. When a person doesn't eat to his full, he feels lighter on his feet. And so it becomes easier for him to pray his ibadah, whether it be the fara'id or the nawafil, whether it be like praying maghrib or praying tahajjud. Any sort of ibadah now becomes easier on that person. When a person eats to his full, he becomes sleepy, he becomes lazy. But when he doesn't, then sleep is not something he really has to battle with. In fact, it's mentioned that a person who eats less actually lives longer. And the answer and the understanding of that could be literal. The eating less is from the qadr of Allah, that it lengthens a person's life. It can be from the kind of medical understanding that we have now, that a person who eats less has better health and therefore he lives longer. Or it can be from the metaphorical sense, in the sense that a person who eats less, sleeps less, And because he spent less of his life sleeping, it's as if he's prolonged his lifetime because he now has more time to do other things that are more important than just sleeping away. So this point is that hunger leads to lightening of the body and requires less sleep when compared to somebody who eats to their full. They are heavy on their feet, more difficult to do their ibadah, and they tend to sleep more, and then it becomes even more difficult to wake up. One of the ulama, Abu Sulaiman ad-Darani, he mentioned that whoever fills himself, then a lot of the difficulties and problems of the world come to him. And he said that from it, or from those problems, is that he loses the sweetness of ibadah. It becomes difficult for him to understand wisdoms. He stops having or feeling sorry or having sympathy for other creation. Why is that? He says because when a person becomes full, he imagines everyone else is full. When he becomes satiated, his needs are met, he feels as if everyone is in the same boat as him. But when he stays hungry, then he's reminded of those people who are also hungry. He's reminded that there are many people throughout the world that are in the same situation, his neighbors perhaps, that he is feeling right now. And then he mentions the last thing for the one who becomes full is that ibadah becomes heavy, becomes difficult, and the desires become greater, as others have mentioned as well. The seventh point that Imam Ghazālī mentions is that his sustenance becomes less or lighter. Or let's say the sustenance that he needs is less. That makes more sense. The sustenance that he needs is less. So when a person eats less, obviously he will need less. But even greater than, when a person eats less, he'll eat less food, right? So obviously his sustenance from that perspective is less. But the point that Imam Ghazālī rahimahullah is making here is not just that. He's saying that when a person becomes content with less food, he will become content with less dunya as well, in all of the things that the dunya has to offer. Because he'll come to realize that when he doesn't need as much food as he thought he needs, then he'll understand that he doesn't need all the other things of the dunya that he felt that he needed. When a person is constantly trying to fill his stomach, the record, or what comes along with that, is that he is constantly trying to fill his other desires as well, and so he never becomes satiated. The one who cannot satiate his stomach will not be able to satiate his other desires as well. So he'll always be looking for more money, more dunya, more cars, more desires to fill. Whereas the one who keeps himself hungry, he realizes, I don't need as much food as I thought I did. And then he'll see the rest of the dunya in that way as well. When he has the opportunity to make more money or to be able to do something else, he'll say, you know what, I don't need that money. Let me do something else of benefit. And so his desires for the dunya become less, and he becomes one who is content with whatever he has. Content with perhaps even poverty if that's what he has. Because he realizes he doesn't need more than that. And then Imam Ghazālī mentioned 7 things. I'm going to, I don't know anything. I'm not in a position to add something to Imam Ghazālī. But there's an 8th thing that other scholars have mentioned. And so I figured I would add it in here as well. And that is that a person gains dominance over his nafs. Meaning, instead of the nafs controlling him, he controls the nafs. So although Imam Ghazālī doesn't mention this explicitly, I think it's implicit in the other things that he mentioned. But for the sake of clarity, for our benefit, I'll mention it explicitly, that when a person takes towards hunger, and the nafs is saying, eat this, eat that, go grab this snack, go grab that snack, or when you haven't eaten all day, so make sure you eat twice as much right now to make up for what you haven't eaten during the day. Then here the nafs is trying to get dominance over that individual. So if the individual tells the nafs, no, this is the limit, we're done now, you don't need to be full, then he gains dominance over that nafs and weakens it. And when he gains dominance and weakens the nafs on this particular issue, he will be able to gain dominance and weaken the nafs on other issues as well. So let me clarify one other thing. that here, just because a person is skinny doesn't mean that they are hungry. Just because a person is skinny doesn't mean that they have dominance over their nafs. There are many people who eat till they're full even though they're skinny. Or they simply just don't have a desire for food. Some people are like that. Some people are foodies. They think about food, they know the names of all the foods, they know the ingredients of all the foods, they know all the restaurants in the area, they know what's halal and what's haram, all the way down to the detail. That is something that they're just like that. And then there's other people who just don't care for food. And that's something natural in them. And what we're looking for here is we're looking for things that are ikhtiyari, things that a person does purposefully. So if a person naturally doesn't like food, it doesn't mean there's some sort of wali of Allah, because that purposefulness isn't there. So the point I want to clarify here is that perhaps some of us may think, you know what, I have no desire for food, and I must be I must have control over my nafs. Whereas in reality, that's just sort of who you are naturally. And that doesn't necessarily equate with somebody who has control over their nafs. Because here the nafs just doesn't care for it. What we want to be is we want to be people who are doing things with ikhtiyar, with purposefulness. So we want to have dominance over the nafs, not the nafs over us, in those issues where the nafs is calling for it. So some people may just be skinny. They may not eat a lot of food, but whatever they eat, that's all they care for. At that point, the nafs is like, okay, that's good enough. But here, what you want is purposefulness. You want to be able to call the shots. You want to be able to tell the nafs, yeah, you want to eat a little bit more? We're done, because I'm in charge here. And so when a person has this ability to stay a little hungry without filling themselves, then they will have dominance over their nafs. When they have dominance over their nafs in this very base, instinctual, one of the strongest desires we have of hunger, then he will find an easier time of gaining dominance over himself or herself in other desires as well. So he'll be able to control his eyes from looking at things that they shouldn't be. He'll be able to control his mouth from saying things that it shouldn't, and so on. Now, obviously, Ramadan is coming up, and Ramadan is a time when we are forced to do this, where it is fard upon us to control our nafs. And this is one of the reasons why throughout Ramadan, we actually have a much easier time of doing ibadah. We have a much easier time of reciting Quran. We have a much easier time of, and we feel it as well. Like during the month of Ramadan, we generally don't, maybe perhaps for a day or two, feel tired, but that's it. After that, we feel lighter on our feet. We feel better. We feel like we can stand for a tarawih, and it's not a big deal. But outside of Ramadan, when we try to stand for 20 raka'ah, we won't be able to do it. And this is also why the habit of the ulama and the salaha in Ramadan is that when iftar comes around, they only eat a little bit. They don't fill themselves, right? Some of us are in the habit, for iftar, we have a meal, fill ourselves. Then we pray maghrib, we come back and we have dinner and we fill ourselves a second time. And then we go to tarawih, and we wonder why it is that we can't do 20. We have to stop after 10 or 8 or whatever number that a person decides has been long enough. Whereas a person, and if you talk to the imams and the huffaz who lead tarawih, they will tell you that they don't really eat dinner. They eat it after tarawih, because they know from experience that if they fill themselves in iftar and dinner, then leading tarawih is very difficult, and they have to be there for 20 rak'at. Whereas the rest of us can sort of doze off while we're standing, or we can walk away when we feel like it. But those who need to do it, they know that you shouldn't fill yourself. So in Ramadan, the point I was making, in Ramadan, we are forced to gain mastery over our nafs, specifically in this. One of the issues that we run into the modern era, and I'll speak about this when we speak about the other desire, is that nowadays our food is so nutrient rich that a person can go 12 hours without eating, and then they will more than make up for it afterwards. And so the desired outcome of fasting is often not achieved for a lot of people. In fact, some of the poor amongst us actually gain weight in the month of Ramadan. So rather than having the effect of gaining over the mastery over the nafs, we oftentimes lose it in the month of Ramadan. So people may fast throughout the entire day, but because of the amount the sheer quantity, caloric intake, and the type of foods they eat afterwards, they find that they spend the nights engaged in other haram, meaning now the eyes are looking at things that they're not supposed to, or they're sitting there watching television for things that have haram images on it, or just wasting the Ramadan, fulfilling other desires instead. So this Ramadan, let's keep this in mind, that during the month, we actually fast in the way that fasting is meant to be done. Meaning we do it in a way where we actually reduce our caloric intake, where we actually eat less so that we find sweetness in our ibadah and we're able to do more of it, and it prevents us from falling into other sins. Any questions? I had mentioned the hadith earlier. The Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned that the son of Adam doesn't fill a worse container than his stomach. That a person should only eat enough to keep their back straight. So the Prophet ﷺ recommended فَثُلُثٌ لِطَعَامِهِ وَثُلُثٌ لِشَرَابِهِ وَثُلُثٌ لِنَفْسِهِ, that he should keep a third of it for his stomach, a third of it of the stomach for food, a third for drink, and a third for breathing. In another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ mentioned the difference between a mu'min and a munafiq by saying that a mu'min eats from one stomach, whereas a munafiq eats from 7 stomachs. Now, this doesn't mean that a munafiq is like a cow with 7 stomachs, literally, but it means it's their desire for food. Whereas a believer just eats what is sufficient for the stomach. And a munafiq, instead, you'll find him eating more than that. Or some of the muhaddithin mentioned that this is a representation of the desires, plural. So whereas a believer fulfills the desires in moderation to what pleases Allah, a munafiq fulfills the desires of 7 people. That is how greedy he is, that is how covetous he is. Some of them mention this, that a believer only eats one type of food. So he's sitting down for dinner, he only has one type of food in front of him. Whereas a munafiq will eat 7 different types of food. Now, this is not to be taken in the sense of a hukum, meaning it is permissible for a person to eat more than one type of food. But we found among the Sahaba, among the Salaf, and among our pious predecessors that they would not do that. So they would usually suffice with just 1 or 2 types of food. Although if a person were to eat more, it's not impermissible. Another scholar, Abu Sulaiman, rahimahullah, he mentioned that indeed leaving one morsel of my dinner is more beloved to me than standing throughout the night in prayer. Meaning the effect of it is what he's speaking about. That if he leaves one morsel and leaves his stomach empty, then that has a greater effect on him from all the things that we just spoke about the benefits of hunger in the spiritual sense and in the physical sense. That is more beloved to him than spending the entire night in prayer, meaning it has a greater effect. It comes in a narration that melt your food with dhikr and salah, with the ibadah of Allah, and don't sleep on your food, meaning don't sleep immediately after eating, because that hardens the heart. So let me explain that again, that after eating, melt your food, meaning digest it, or follow it with the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and prayer, whether it be the nawafil before you go to sleep or tahajjud, and don't go to sleep on that full stomach because it hardens the heart. And as I had mentioned before, that Imām Ghazālī gave an explanation for that, saying that a person, actually it was Imām Darani had given the explanation, saying that this is because when a person goes to sleep full, he imagines that everybody else is full as well, and then he doesn't feel for other people. Now, there is a trap involved here, right? With all the things that have to do with breaking desires, there's always traps that the shayateen or the shaitan can use against you. This is why it's important that We study these sciences with people who know about these sciences. And then when we trek upon this path, we keep connected to somebody of knowledge so that they can guide us so we don't fall into these traps. And so one of the biggest traps of a person who tries to use hunger for their islah is that it can often lead to riyā, ostentation. That a person starts to think of himself because he's not filling his stomach, he's losing weight, he's becoming skinny as he imagines the awliyā to be, and then he starts thinking that he is one of them. And then that is destructive for him. Or he starts to walk around telling people, I'm fasting today. And everyone's getting together to eat, and he's like, I can't eat with you guys. I'm fasting today and tomorrow and the day after. And he makes a show of it. And that's very easy to do. And so when that happens and he crosses the line, or he may cross the line into riyā, and then riyā is even worse than the desire for food. So something to keep in mind about not overdoing it or falling into falling into another disease as you're trying to solve one disease. Any questions? All right, so with that, we're going to move on to the next desire. And again, given your age, or the age of most of the people here, this is an extraordinarily important desire, and that is what's called shahwatul farj. This is the desire of the private parts. This is the desire of that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks to when He says, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الْفَوَاحِشِ, that don't go towards evil or lewd acts. And وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا إِنَّهُ كَانَ فَاحِشَةً وَسَاءَ سَبِيلًا, that don't go near zina because it is of the worst of actions and it is an evil path. So here it's very important to understand, and one of the mistakes that many modern speakers make today is that they say zina is haram and that khalwa, being alone with the opposite gender, is haram. And then after that, they say pretty much everything else is okay, or it's debated, or it's disagreed upon. And unfortunately, we are such today that when something is disagreed upon, we take that as permission. Before, in the past, when something was disagreed upon, then people took that as prohibition. Because if something was harmful, they would stay away from it, right? If someone said, oh, there's only a drop of urine in this gallon of milk, a person would say, I'm not drinking any of it. I don't care if it's like one molecule of it. I don't want that. Today, instead, if somebody offers you something and says, why don't you do this? The scholars are disagreed upon doing it. We say, okay, that sounds like permission to me. I'll go ahead and do it. So people have changed. And the scholars of the past, and many of the proper scholars today, and all the proper scholars today, they understand that zina, khalwa, these things are haram, no doubt. But even coming close to it is also impermissible. And this is what it means, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الْفَوَاحِشِ وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا. They understand that the Sharia is not there to just say, stay away from the edge of Jahannam. But rather, the Sharia is there to say, don't even go close to those things that will lead you into Jahannam. And so when Allah says, don't go near fawahish or don't go near zina, it means anything that would take you even remotely close to that. So this also applies to khalwa, that it is impermissible to be alone, but it's also impermissible to even come close to that. So khalwa virtually is impermissible. And that would be like texting or social, any other sort of online media that allows you to speak to somebody one-on-one without other people knowing. It would also include in situations where, for example, you may be outside in public, but the public is such, as our public is today, that they don't care if men and women come together. So although you're in the public, you have a certain amount of khalwa, because you can speak about anything. You can look at one another in a way that Allah has made forbidden. To look at the awrah of another individual that Allah has made forbidden. And so all of this falls into not coming close to it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَسَاءَ سَبِيلًا, that the path towards zina, the path towards fahisha, that too is an evil path. So not the destination, but the path that takes you to that destination, all of it is. So this is the hikmah behind all of this. That is not just falling into that which is qat'an haram, but not even coming close to it in any way. Now, obviously with a desire, as we had mentioned before, every desire has a benefit, has a purpose. Allah didn't create these desires to be eradicated, but the desires were made so that they can be controlled. So even when it comes to the desire of the private parts, it needs to be controlled. And I think that's pretty obvious to everyone. But here, what I'd like to stress to you guys, it's not controlling yourself from just zina, but it's controlling yourself from even coming close to it. So anything that leads to that would also be something that is to be avoided. So what's the benefit? Why did Allah create this desire within us? The first benefit is to have children. That if the desire wasn't there, then children wouldn't be born. And if children weren't born, then the human race would come to an end. And this is not what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants. Allah wants, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam made it very clear that He wants a very large ummah of believers on the Day of Judgment. So that's one benefit. The other benefit is that there is desire in this, but that desire, as we spoke about earlier, there's a punishment in hunger that reminds you of the punishment in the akhirah. There is a desire in the desire of the private parts that reminds you of the desires of the akhirah as well, meaning those things that one can look forward to. So everyone will have a companion in Jannah, and it's something to look forward to. So while a person controls himself in this dunya, he's not able to get married, so he controls himself, or he is able to get married, but then once he's married, he's not looking at other people, or before he's married, he's not looking at other people. He can remind himself that this desire that Allah has put in me that I am not able to fulfill right now, I will be able to fulfill it in the akhirah. So it's something to look forward to as a form of encouragement. We had discussed earlier, or Imam Ghazālī rahimahullah had discussed earlier, about whether it's better to remain unmarried or to get married. Meaning, is it better to remain unmarried and dedicate your life to the deen and ibadah, or is it better to get married and also dedicate your life to deen and ibadah? So we had mentioned that there's two different opinions on this. I had stressed the opinion of the Hanafis, and I think in today's age, even those prior scholars like Imam Ghazālī, Imam Nawawi, and others who actually said that it's better to not get married, my feeling is that if those scholars saw the situation of today, that even they would say, for people today, it's better to get married. Now, how does that affect the islah of a person? Because this is really the purpose of our class. When a person, so Imam Ghazālī mentioned something really interesting. He says that if a person doesn't get married, then he is able to devote his heart to Allah alone. That the heart can only contain one love. And if a person has nothing else to love, no one else to love but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then it becomes very easy to connect with Allah. That one of the things that prevents the person from walking the path, meaning the path of tasawwuf and islah, is that he is enamored by somebody else. So he says that in the beginning, for the sadiq, it's better to be unmarried so that he can devote himself towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then afterwards, once he has mastery over his nafs and has reached a certain stage, then he can and should go ahead and get married. Now, obviously that sort of brings up a lot of questions. That what about the person who has desires? What about the person who's already married? Does that mean it's too late for him to walk the path? And so on. So let's contextualize that. Imam Ghazālī rahimahullah, he says that if a person has desire towards the opposite gender, then he should lessen it, meaning he's not able to fulfill that desire. Then he should lessen it with hunger. And he says a tawil, long hunger, long periods of hunger, and of fasting continuously to achieve that. Now, before I go on, let me mention that the situation we live in again is different. In our times, fawahish and desires have overcome us to such a degree, and by that I mean that they are all around us, constantly there. It's very difficult to escape it. That is, it's overcome us to such a degree that it's covered our eyes and our ears, meaning it's blinded us to such an extent that it's in our face so much that we can't see anything else. That from that perspective, that even the one who fasts and even the one who takes to hunger finds that his desires don't really lessen. This is the state of the day. This is how it is today. That we are raised in a hypersexualized environment that it's near impossible to run away from it. And so for that reason, a person oftentimes, and I've had many young men come to me and say that I fast and it does nothing. I cut down my food, I've lost weight, but it does nothing. The eyes still wander, and I still find myself doing things that I shouldn't do. So we also have to contextualize ourselves. And as I mentioned some of the reasons earlier for why hunger doesn't really have an effect, here another reason for why fasting often does not work is because we are just so surrounded and overcome by hypersexualization that traditional treatment doesn't work in the way that it used to work. So Imam Ghazālī says that a person who's not able to control his desires, and he stops for a moment and he says that what he means by controlling his desires isn't that a person can't prevent Zinā or a person can't prevent khalwa. What the definition he gives for not being able to control the desire is that he's not able to control his eyes. Then marriage is better for that person. Let me just step back and sort of rewind and say that again so we're very clear on what's being said here. That Imam Ghazālī said from the Islahi perspective, from the perspective of tasawwuf, initially he was saying it's better to not get married. That way a person can devote his attention, his time, his ibadah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala completely. And so ideally he would do that, and then once he reaches a certain stage, then he would get married and he would go into the world, for example. But he says there's an exception to that rule. And that exception is that a person is not able to control his desires otherwise. He fasts and it doesn't have an effect. He takes to hunger and it doesn't have an effect. And what is the effect that he's looking for? Is control over the eyes. So he does those things and he's not able to control his eyes. Then Imam Ghazālī says, فَالنِّكَاهُ لَهُ أَوْلَى. The nikah is better for that person. He should get married. So I think for us in our situation today, given the environment, the context that we live in, all the things that I already mentioned, that what is best for a person is that as soon as they're able to, that they look to get married. And if they're not able to right now, then they should make that a priority. So instead of engaging in things that might be fard kifaya or engaging in things that may be just nawafil, it is better for that person to make whatever moves and ambitions that he needs to fulfill so that he can earn a halal income, so that he can support another individual, so that he can get married. And again, we are so skewed today that we think that supporting another individual means that we need to be able to get a car for them, the other person. We need to be able to have a house with a garage. We need to have all of our bills paid off. No, none of this is necessary. What is necessary is the minimum to be able to feed, clothe, and house a person. That's a 1-bedroom apartment. That's a basement rented out. That is taking public transportation. And that is all of these things without all of the additional things that we've added on. I've even met people nowadays who say they can't get married because they can't afford a vacation every year. And if I want to, my spouse and I, we want to be able to travel to different places at least once a year for a week. And so we need to have money to do that. Right now, I don't have money to do that. So our definition of having enough money has been skewed, and because of that, things have become very difficult. And not just us as individuals, I've found many parents have also fallen into this trap. And so they cause a lot of difficulty. In fact, many of them are willing to look away from the difficulties that they have put their children into, so that they can achieve this sort of artificial standard or a concept of living that they have created for themselves. Anyway, coming back to the islahi aspect of it, if a person cannot get married, then he should control his desires in other ways. The chief and foremost way is to block out those things that are haram. That means movies, television, doom scrolling, music. I can't remember if I mentioned that or not. Music is a high priority on the list. And just keep in mind, what is it that you're looking at? The movies you're watching, the television you're watching, the dramas that nowadays even American born and raised for some reason are stuck in, like Arab and Pakistani dramas. Are you looking at things that are haram on there, that are causing difficulty for you? So all of these things need to be taken into account. If you remove the triggers, if you remove that which leads to zina, that leads to fahisha, then you'll find it much easier to stay away from those things that are forbidden. But if you continue to expose yourself to fawahish, then of course you're going to have thoughts, of course you're going to have desires, and you're going to have a very difficult time lessening them. So a person who does both things, one is eliminating those things that take you towards zina and fahisha, and at the same time increasing those things that lessen the desires, like hunger and fasting. Between the two of those, a person will be most of the time able to control themselves. And if they're not, then make moves to get married, or do all of those things simultaneously. Since we're on the topic of marriage, and Imam Ghazālī mentions this, I'll finish with this, that he says that it's important for a woman to be less than a man in 4 things. And this is just sort of a limnan to, along with the concept of marriage. We're not talking about the islahi stuff at this point. So his recommendation that a woman should be less than a man in 4 things. Number 1, in age. Number 2, in height. Number 3, in wealth. And then number 4, in social standing. So, some of this is cultural. It's not a hard and fast rule. Obviously, the Prophet ﷺ married women who were older than him, who were more wealthy than him. And the Sahaba and the Salaf did the same as well. But the wisdom behind this is that in these aspects, which are generally aspects that have to do with dunya, it is better for a man to be above a woman, because people generally in the dunya tend to value these things, and they tend to look up to people who have that, and they tend to look down upon people who don't have it. So an older woman may look down upon a younger man and say, oh, he's immature, he doesn't know what he's doing, and so on, or look down upon, literally maybe look down upon one that's shorter and consider herself to be of a greater stature, lack of a better word. And then he says that a woman should be greater than a man in 4 things: in beauty, in adab, in decorum and manners, in piety, and in character. So in beauty, in adab, piety, and in character. And the same thing, these are things that are valued in women, and these are things that men generally find attractive. And in addition to that, especially when it comes to things like adab and piety, that these are things that actually benefit men. And so if they marry someone who has this type of characteristic, then they will become more pious. The dunya, and because of our responsibility in the dunya, it tends to harden people. And so it's good to have somebody who has piety, who can influence them in the opposite direction. When you have to deal with the public, it also creates a certain type of character that can be rough and abrasive. And so it's good to have a spouse, a wife at home who has the opposite, so that it can help smooth out that abrasiveness that you pick up from being out and about, dealing with the real world. Any questions? All right. Inshallah, I actually thought there would be some questions given the great importance of the topic and the fact that everyone has to deal with it all the time. But khair, that's what the group is there as well, the Telegram group, if you want to ask anything. Next week, inshallah, we'll be back in person. Let me say it again. Next week, we'll be back in person. Same room, I think. Same time. We'll meet at 5 p.m. and we'll take a break for Maghrib as needed. And inshallah, next week we will speak about the diseases of the tongue, or the harms of the tongue, which is actually a fairly long chapter that we'll need to go through, but inshallah we'll get through it. All right, jazakumullahu khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.